What are the limits of China's debt diplomacy approach to Africa? Well, joining me to discuss this topic is Jessica van Onselen, who's a consultant who does a lot of work with governments and private organizations across sub-Saharan Africa. Jessica, welcome to the CRA channel. Could you tell us, first of all, what has informed China's strategy in terms of its approach to lending in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly to countries that are in a fiscally precarious position?
Yes, I think your viewers will be well aware that China has positioned itself over the last few decades as a friend to Africa, as a trading partner, but perhaps most significantly as a creditor. And China has taken on a lot of debt, loaning to African governments, perhaps in contexts where Western bilateral institutions might have been a bit less flexible, more conditions. China has demonstrated itself to be responsive and approachable about these sort of things. However, this has proven to be quite an expensive strategy, as I think we are starting to see. There are particularly a group, it's not the whole of Africa, but there is a large group of about 10 and some might say 13 African countries who've accumulated significant China debt and, most importantly, appear unable to service that debt. And that would include countries like Angola, who's currently, I believe, negotiating deferring their debt. And earlier this month, Zambia defaulted on paying its debt, not just to China, to others. But there is a significant amount of debt there.
So I'd like to pick up on one of those examples, Jessica, particularly Zambia. Zambia is richly endowed with copper and other resources such as cobalt, the DRC too. But looking at this situation that Zambia now finds itself in, it seems to have sacrificed its sovereignty over its financial accounts, basically to external creditors. So what is the risk there? What does the Zambian example tell us?
I really like Zambia. Let's actually talk about the copper belt. So just to remind your viewers, that's the resource that extends from northern Zambia up to southern DRC. I'm playing a little bit fast and loose with the term copper belt because it is a technical resource, but I'll use it in the context of this conversation just as a shorthand for the mineral economic activity that flows over those two countries. And it's a really emblematic example of China's perhaps motives in its sub-Saharan African strategy. And that is because copper is a critical primary commodity, raw material that is vital for inputs for construction and technology, but it's the byproduct of cobalt that is increasingly becoming a strategic mineral. And China's moves in the last couple of years to secure its presence on the copper belt, both in northern Zambia, but also in southern and particularly in southern DRC, shows that this debt strategy we were just talking about, it's not just to get soft diplomacy or to be an ideal trading partner. It's also about putting China in pole position to be able to secure either direct or indirect influence over mines that are producing these rare, or in cobalt's case, extremely rare mineral. Why is cobalt so important? It's because it's a core component as an input into lithium-ion batteries. And as we move towards renewables, the commitments that are made under the Paris Accord, the requirement that we manufacture and engineer a whole swathe of new technologies to reduce emissions in the future, lithium-ion batteries are going to be absolutely critical in that race. And so just in preparation for this interview, I was just having a look at some of the major and medium tier producers in southern DRC. And I looked up 13 copper or cobalt mines. And out of those 13, 10 have either direct Chinese majority shareholding, or the operators have offtake agreements with China, which make sure that most of their cobalt is sold directly to China. So if you just stop and think about that, that is extraordinary control over this key mineral producing region, 10 out of 13 mines. Similarly, if you move down in Zambia, you do have some of the older Western affiliated miners there. There are 4 big ones. But look to the next tier of sort of medium and smaller producers. Again, just at my count, 5 out of the 9 producers there, Chinese controlled. So if you zoom out and you just look at that, and we return to what we were discussing, which is the debt and China's control over raw commodities, their influence in the copper belt is substantial.
So Jessica, you mentioned that China's strategy was a very expensive one. What do you think are the limits of this approach that the Chinese are taking in terms of their engagement with countries in sub-Saharan Africa? How do you see this playing out going forward?
The reason I said expensive is for two reasons. I think one, when you take on that much debt and it becomes clear that some of your debtors are not going to be able to repay you, that is an extremely expensive outlay of cash and you're not going to see any return for it. And the second thing is that the mines I was just talking about, particularly in the southern DRC, are not always profitable. So it would be a mistake to think that they control large swathes of the copper belt, but are making a fortune and that that's all very lucrative. It's expensive to do business in the DRC. Capital is expensive, infrastructure is expensive. And so one does start to wonder when China is going to fatigue, perhaps, of being a creditor, and what the limits are for willing to pump cash into the strategy in order to secure these primary commodities. Remember, the Chinese economy is slowing down. We're unlikely to see the 7% growth rates that we saw perhaps 10 years ago. And in this context, I would not be surprised if a lot of investors are starting to ask questions about just how much road does Chinese debt trap diplomacy have in front of it before they need to rethink.
Yes, and of course, you use that term road, I think, deliberately, Jessica. The Belt and Road Initiative is a key part of China's projection of its not only economic power, but its soft political power as well. So just in terms of global geopolitics, how does this fit in terms of China's strategy? Because I would imagine that this economic dependency relationship that it's cultivated with many African countries is quite useful, for example, in forums like the United Nations, where you're trying to get votes in order to support your particular interest or cause. What is your view on China's global role at the moment?
I think anyone who's paying attention to China has seen that she is trying to set out a legacy potentially to rival Mao. He certainly has ambition. He certainly wants to take China's position as superpower forward on steroids. And we've also seen this against the backdrop of a retreating United States. If we just zoom back to my example of the copper belt, America has, if not been slow to recognize what's happening with supply chains there, they've certainly been slow to respond. We did just see Tesla recently starting to sign an offtake agreement and starting to think about those strategic minerals. But to get back to your point, yes, I think that this is about China wanting to really position itself as the true global superpower. And that does mean that in Africa, it is going to exert a lot of influence through its economic relationships. But I do wonder if indebtedness automatically translates into fealty at the United Nations or in other contexts. It might, but African governments also have their own minds and their own agendas and their own domestic priorities.
Well, Jessica, thank you very much. We'll certainly be watching China's moves on the continent very closely indeed. My name is David Ansara. Please remember, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and also check out the link in the description below to our 30-day free trial. Also, let us know what you think in the comments section. What is China's endgame in sub-Saharan Africa?